Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derek, and over there on this or that side of me, who
The
knows?
right or the left,
Yeah, the
or
other
just in
side,
the other ear hole if you're listening to us on audio.
indeed. That would be annoying actually if I had one of us coming out of one side. That yeah, I wouldn't do that.
Oh, that would be a little too much. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that would be not worthwhile. Yeah, is Evan, I guess, or that.
How we doing?
Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, we are continuing with Genesis 3:17. No reason to read it this time because we're not going into the specific words of the verse.
Mhm.
Instead, I want to return to this idea that it's merely the serpent and the land that are cursed in this section, but not the man and the woman, right? They do now face greater difficulty, right? But they are not cursed directly.
Mhm.
Now, this I think plays into the idea that this is a story about the humanity's maturation rather than humanity's fall, which is something you and I discussed in one of the previous episodes. That the term "fall" I'm not as big a fan of because again I see this as the maturation of humanity. This is where things were always going, right? Again, the beginning of this section being that Adam is finally named, right? So the
And it
idea, of
never
course,
says anything. It never says the word fall, and it never says the word maturation. So you can make an
neither,
argument for
neither,
either.
and of course,
You could say anything
um,
else,
absolutely, you could
but yeah,
use whatever term you want to
the
argue.
degeneration of man. I don't know.
Yes, yes. So the idea here is that surely God knew conceptually, right, in addition to his foreknowledge, that a set of beings with free will that are placed in a world with the possibility of sin and not being perfect in their ability to unfailingly choose righteousness were inevitably going to sin, right?
Mhm.
So God curses. What he does is he curses those who lead others to sin, the serpent, and the consequences of sin is a curse upon creation.
Mhm.
But the man and the woman who are doing the thing that they were inevitably going to do aren't cursed directly.
Mhm.
Um, Now, one might be tempted to say that despite the term not being used, the greater labor pains, toils against the land, and certainly death as a result of sin are accursed, right? That's
Mhm.
that's all accursed, even if the term wasn't used. But the term not being used and being used in the other cases should give us a clue, though, as to how to interpret those things and understand how God sees sin in us, right? That's what I'm really going to try and get to here. God is he's making a distinction between the consequences and then the proactive curses, if
Mhm.
that makes sense. So we already talked about how the psychological labor, right, of the feminine perspective um, endures and is much greater as a because of the reality of sin
Mhm.
and why that was, and that we could see kind of when we talked about this idea that it is not a result of God cursing us, but it's rather baked into kind of the reality of creation, right? And
Mhm.
what it is to be human just means that naturally sin makes that feminine rebirth more painful, right?
Mhm.
Even though it was painful prior to that. Um,
Mhm.
Likewise, in the next couple of verses, we see that the masculine task becomes more difficult because of the fact of sin as well.
Mhm.
But again, it's something baked into the reality of creation and what it means to be human. It's not a proactive curse on the human. It's that the ground has become more
Mhm.
difficult to work with. Similarly, we understand intellectually why a perfect God would want to create a separation between himself and sin, right? That makes sense, right? To not do so, to not have a separation between a perfect God and sin would sully that perfection. So there needs to be some kind of separation. The extent of this separation is sort of debatable, and what exactly our relationship with God, what that's supposed to be, is something that, Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox might disagree on. However, the idea that there is separation as a result of sin is something we certainly don't disagree on. And the separation from God, we talked about this actually when we talked about on that day you surely shall die. The idea that any sort of separation from God, because God is the source of life, any sort of separation from him is a kind of death, right? That which is not life is death. So any separation from life is death. But again, even there, we see that death, it's a consequence of sin, not a curse, right? Because God must separate himself from you if you sin, because that sullies the perfection of God. And so God could not, remain perfect if he were too close, I guess, or not separated from that which is sinful. So it's just a consequence. It's just kind of baked into the reality of things. Now, God does rightfully have sort of a wrath and anger towards sin. He does. But in his love for us, he chooses not to place the curse upon us directly, but rather curses temptation and then the world we inhabit. That to me is very interesting, right? And I think here, actually, in that, we see kind of the beginning of God's redemptive process, right? He loves us so deeply that he refuses to take out his anger at sin directly upon us. So even though we are the ones who sinned, he still loves us so much that he can't sort of bring himself to say, okay, you are cursed. No, the temptation that led you there, that's cursed. Other things are cursed as a consequence of you, but I'm not going to curse you directly, right? And through Christ, one day he wipes out, the damage of sin altogether. But just the fact that he would do this is interesting to me, that he would do these things. And in time, we'll learn that the curses against the temptation and the curses against the world, those will be wiped out as well, as there's everything is replaced with a new and better creation. But we are spared the fate of being cursed ourselves, and ultimately through Christ given a chance to inhabit that new creation.
The thing that strikes me as interesting in this is, so there's and I'm going to try and I'm going a little bit from memory here, and I'm going a little bit from I'm going to try and simplify this as much as I can, but there's this idea in economics, in game theory, which is, for those who aren't familiar with game theory, the classic problem that's presented in game theory is you have two people who commit a crime together, and then they're both captured and arrested, and then they're put in separate cells, and they're given a deal. They say, look, if you plead guilty, then we'll give, and you say that your other guy did it and you rat him out, then you will get a shorter sentence. Oh, but if you argue I'm innocent, then you probably will win and you won't get any sentence. However, if your other friend says you're guilty, then you'll get a terrible sentence if you tried to say you're innocent. And so you're faced with this challenge of saying, how much do I trust the other person who is in this, who committed this crime with me?
The key is, if neither of them were to confess, then they would get something between that, right? So let's say
if neither of them confess, then they're off scot-free. But
I've heard it where they get 2 years, right? If neither were to confess, they get 2 years. If one rats out the other, the one that does the ratting gets 6 months, and the other one gets 5 years,
something like that. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Or if they both confess, then they both end up getting 6 years. It doesn't. So the thing that they're playing with is they're thinking to themselves, do I trust the other person not to rat me out? And you could play this game as an iteration of once, where that happens, and then they deal with the consequences and they're done.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
what game theorists do is they tried to say, well, what would happen if you played this game once and then you play it again and then you play it again and you play it again and again and to infinity? What they concluded was, well, in the first game, you should default to trusting the other person. So you should say, I'm not guilty, we're not guilty, and default that that person's not going to do it.
Hmm.
But if in that first game or any other game afterwards, that person, well, if that person says not guilty and you trust them and they keep up their end of the bargain, then you play again and you do the same thing. And you do the same thing and things keep going well. However, if at any point one of them decides to break the trust of the other, then for the rest of the games, they should not trust them going forward.
Hmm.
So the idea is that if at any single given point somebody breaks the trust, the whole system collapses in on itself.
Right.
Exactly. And so this is because this is an idea that I always struggled with, was like, how in the world does sin cause corruption in the world? And it's like, that feels like a good representation of it to me, is that as soon as one individual in this game between the two breaks the trust, the whole game is corrupted
Hmm.
and it all falls apart.
Hmm.
And in that way, it's the game that's corrupted. It's the earth that's corrupted. It's not the player that's corrupted. They're just going to have to deal, though, with playing in a corrupted game now, which means their partner's not going to trust them.
And ultimately, they behave corruptly.
Exactly. As a
Right?
response to it.
By ratting
Because
out the
now
other
they're
person,
in a corrupted
which is weird
game.
that now the corrupt thing is, it's
Is the
inversed, I guess, but the way we're describing it. But in a way, ratting out the other person is the corruption of the game. It's just weird to play that because we're the criminals are now, But yes,
it's
once
a matter
the whole
of
game is corrupt, then other people, they just behave corruptly, and so that is how, like, as a result of sin being in the world, we all inevitably sin.
Yeah. This is the way I like to think about it is just like in a relationship. If you're in a relationship with somebody and they're behaving faithfully and true,
Mhm.
and you're behaving faithfully and true as you're supposed to, well, then life goes on and things are going great. When they break something and that trust or something like that, or they behave unfaithfully, improperly, then that kind of corrupts the relationship in that.
Right.
And that becomes, and then they could take advantage of you if you keep behaving faithfully. And so it becomes a really difficult situation, which is why you end up with Christ saying, and the representation of the prophets being, you get abused for behaving faithfully.
Right.
Well, you get abused for behaving faithfully because other people aren't.
Mhm.
And they've corrupted the game. And so you're existing in a corrupted game, and you could go along with that or you could not. And so this is where the ground is cursed because of man, because, well, they've corrupted existence, the game. And so things are going to be more difficult for them now.
Yes. Although I will say this, granting everything that we've said, right, one still could argue that by creating the game as it is, right, a world that holds these consequences, and humanity free to choose poorly, and God knowing that humanity will choose poorly because that's what we'll inevitably do, it's still kind of like God did curse humanity, right? You could make that argument, and one may make that argument. So to that, I will simply say that if one wanted to make that argument, we have different conceptions of God, right? Because to me, there's no better way to know God's mercy, his forgiveness, the depth of his love. There's no better way to know that than the dynamic that exists, the dynamic that we have created because of our sin, right? So if God didn't set the game up this way, then we couldn't know those parts of him as we now have the opportunity to do. And we experience aspects of God as a result of this way that creation is set up, that even the angels aren't given the opportunity to. And we're told that this is something that the angels do not experience of God, and they are jealous in a way, right, of our opportunity to experience these things. So really, right, the way that God has designed creation, even though it may look like, yeah, but isn't that still a curse because he could have not created this way? It's actually an incredible blessing, right? Because that's really the only word we could use to describe the opportunity to know these aspects of God, the mercy, the forgiveness, the love. And so it's interesting, right, that we can see that in these verses here where these curses are given. We see that God has set up these curses because it in a roundabout way blesses us, right? Which is interesting too, to think about the idea of humanity being the purpose for which creation exists, right? And the idea that God is willing to curse creation if it gives us a chance to better understand him, if it blesses us. And so we clearly are above all of creation in that way. Mm-hmm. So, all right. Well, with that, let's wrap up 3:17. Next time, we'll move on to the rest of what God says to Adam here. In the meantime, like, subscribe, check us out, unschooledtheology.com, email us, unschooledtheology@protonmail.com. And we'll see you again next time. Thanks.